Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends. We would like to say welcome. On behalf of the team of Amani, I'm welcoming everyone, and we're very sorry about the bit of a delay. I'm going to invite Ambassador William Karu, the head of ECOSOC, to do the welcoming remark.
Thank you very much. You know, as a civil society, we are not used to this diplomatic title. But fortunately for me, my government thought it necessary to recognize. So I'm still finding it strange and difficult to be called in that manner. So I fully understand. You can still call me William. It's still okay. Your Excellencies, distinguished representatives of member states, Dr. Solomon Dasso, Executive Director of Pan-Africa, esteemed leaders of civil society organizations with particular reference to the ECOSOC standing committees that are present here this afternoon, colleagues from academia and research institutions, representatives of our development partners, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is my profound honor on behalf of Africa and the Economic, Social, and Cultural Council of the Africa Union to welcome you at this joint high-level policy dialogue on what is the defining question of our generation, Africa path forward at a moment when the world order itself stands at a crossroad. Colleagues, we are gathered at a moment of profound uncertainty and extraordinary possibilities. The post-1945 global order is fracturing. The United Nations Security Council remains paralyzed by great power rivalry. Multilateral institutions designed for a different era struggle with contemporary challenges. The promises of globalization have given way to protectionism and fragmentation. Climate finance commitments remain unkept. Vaccine equity proved illusory. Development assistance shrink even as humanitarian needs explode. The above are just some examples of the stark reality we face ourselves. At the same time, our continent faces its own crossroads. We have made remarkable strides. AfCFTA represents the world's largest free trade area by number of countries. Our peace and security architecture, both AGA and APSA, has matured. Democratic space has expanded in many countries. Youth-led innovation flourishes across our cities. Regional integration is deepening incrementally. Yet, we also confront persistent challenges, to name a few: terrorism and violent extremism, stretching across the Sahel and Lake Chad basin, climate shocks devastating communities from the Horn to Southern Africa, governance deficit undermining citizens' trust, the ever-persistent risk that external actors exploit our division. The question before us isn't whether Africa faces challenges. Every region and every country does. The question is whether we face them together with strategic coherence and a Pan-African solidarity, or whether we fragment into competing nationalism and external dependency. Pan-Africanism has always been more than sentiment. It has been survival strategy. Our forefathers knew that scattered colonies could never defeat colonialism. Only united liberation movement could. Our parents knew that isolated economies could never achieve development. Only integrated markets could. Today, we must know that fragmented sovereignties cannot navigate a multipolar world. Only collective African agency can. But Pan-Africanism in 2026 cannot be the Pan-Africanism of 1963 or even in 2002. It must evolve. It must mean AFCTA protocol implemented, not just signed. It must mean a single African position at the United Nations Security Council, which we still don't have. It must mean pooled resources for pandemic preparedness, climate adaptation, and continental infrastructure. Most importantly, when one African country faces pressure, economic coercion, political interference, security threat, they should not stand alone. We should stand united as African. The breakdown of global order can be seen both as a threat and opportunity for every African. Everyone is just focusing on the threat. But today, let's look at the unprecedented opportunity. A fragmented unipolar order becomes a multipolar world where Africa's 1.5 billion people, vast resources, and strategic geography give us leverage we have never had. A crisis in multilateralism creates space to redesign institutions, to finally reform the UN Security Council, to restructure international financial institutions, and to build new coalition for Global South. As I conclude, let's be candid and let's acknowledge failures alongside successes. Challenge the orthodoxies, think systematically, and above all, be practical. Recommend what can actually be implemented, not just what sounds nice or good in our ears. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you once again, and I want to indicate that ECOSOC commits to ensuring that the insights generated in this room reach the AU decision makers through our reporting line, that your recommendations are documented and advanced through appropriate structures, and that this dialogue become part of an ongoing conversation, not a one-time event. Africa is indeed at a crossroad, but crossroads are not where we get stuck. They are where we choose our direction. Let me end by this. Africa does not need to choose between East and West, North and South. Africa needs to choose Africa. Welcome once again, and thank you very much.
Thank you, William, for setting the tone for the discussion that we're going to have in the following sessions. Now, I would like to invite our director, Dr. Salomon Derso, to moderate the first session of the event. It will be an opening address, and it will give us a strategic framing for it.
Thank you very much. Tafsat is our senior researcher at Amani Africa. Today, she's the one that I would like to acknowledge with a special thanks. In the research work that we do at Amani Africa, Tafsat always stands out, but also importantly, she takes lead and initiate thinking. Thank you very much, Tafsat, for your great work that make Amani Africa what it is. I don't want to make speeches because it's a busy time. We go straight to the business. So what I will do is to really express Amani Africa's sincere appreciation to a great panel that we have this afternoon to share their rich experience and perspectives and insights. And we have the pleasure of bringing this together through the collaboration that we have with the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, ECOSOC, that Ambassador William, who just spoke, leads, and also importantly, as we always do in Amani Africa, with a member state, and that is Burundi. the incoming chairperson of the African Union. Ambassador Willie Nyamitwe was here just before the start of this session, but he was called for an urgent engagement with his Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is in town. And he has expressed his regrets that he couldn't be able to be with us today. But we also have the distinguished honor of having as a permanent representative member of the African Union, and of course, a member of the Peace and Security Council, Her Excellency Ambassador Hirut, who is with us under very busy circumstances, and she requested that we will give her time to speak early on, and I will ask for the indulgence of the gentleman sitting here. Ambassador, please, may I ask you to join the high table, kindly? I would like to express my deep appreciation to Ambassador Swef, who has always without fail, been available and willing to collaborate with the wider African Union that is beyond member states, such as Amani Africa. So we are grateful for that. And of course, we have difficult question for you. Is the AU relevant? Does it still matter? Over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Salmon, dear brother. Excellencies, ambassadors, directors, Dr. Salomon, professors, colleagues, fellow researchers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like, first of all, to follow Ambassador William to renounce this title of ambassador and to be one of the researchers who should work with Dr. Salmon from now. So please forget about this title of ambassador. I'm not anymore ambassador. I'm a researcher. Thank you. I'm a researcher after spending 20 years in the field, 6 years in Darfur, 6 years in the north of Mali, and many other years in Somalia. So I forgot the practice of ambassadors, and I'm sure that the ambassador of Cuba will agree with me. Ladies and gentlemen, it is both an honor and a responsibility to address you today on the eve of the 39th Ordinary Summit of the African Union, at a moment of profound significance for our continent and for the international system as a whole. We meet under the theme, Africa at a crossroads, because Africa is indeed facing a defined historical moment. The choices we make today will shape our position, our voice, and our agency for decades to come. It is always a pleasure to talk about Pan-Africanism. I don't know whether there is a nostalgia, because Pan-Africanism, this will lead us and bring us to the 50s, when people were struggling for the independence of our countries and our continent. That has been done. I mean, we got autonomy, technical autonomy in many of our countries in the 50s, and then in the 60s, we got our independence. But which kind of independence? We're looking for political independence, we're looking for economic independence. I don't know which independence we got, but the people like Paul and Dr. Solomon, they are still questioning the leaders, our principal everywhere. Which kind of independence we got in the 60s or in the 50s? So this independence, I think, brought us to think about a couple of things. And those things, among them, thinking about democracy, but which kind of democracy we're looking for, and which kind of democracy we exercise in our countries in the 60s, 70s. When you say that let's have one political party, like one family, all of us, we are united. You bring everybody in the family. So it sounds good when you bring everybody together and as one family. This is how we used to rule our countries in the 60s and early in the 70s. But when we moved to the 80s and 90s especially, we said that no, let's think about multilateralism. So then I can do what I want to do. In many countries, for example, where, they had only one ruling party, one political party, they moved to suddenly, 20 political parties, 50 political parties. This has started, I think, when people, they organized what we call the Conférence Nationale after the summit of La Baule. So a small country like the smallest country in Africa, I think Comoros, for example. So when you go there and you find that we have over 30 come to Addis Ababa, look for one, El Qasim, and said that, can you advise our people? So then we bring them at least not 30 political parties, but at least 20 or 10 political parties. Or at least 4 political parties as we have 4 islands. So this is with me manager, and he helped us when he was in working with the African Union in the Department of Conflict Management. And I think that following his advice and guidance, we managed to achieve a lot, and I'm proud that he is here. He can talk about the Comoros, not only Addis or Mali, but he has good legacy and milestone everywhere. Talking about democracy, we'll talk also about good governance, but which kind of good governance we are talking about? We'll talk about rule of law, but which one we are talking about? So the expectation there was very high. In our countries, but people, they keep saying that we should move forward and see how we can work very hard, and then our voice could be heard in the world. So then, I think since early 2000, people, they start thinking about the place of Africa in the global arena. People, they start thinking about the reforms of the Security Council and the place of Africa. Today, we have 15 countries, and out of those 15 countries, you have 5 they have permanent seat. And then we said that we should look for a permanent seat, at least 2 for the continent. And then we keep saying that also those reforms should cover and take into consideration our position in the IMF and the World Bank. So people are so excited and are working very hard to reach the level. But unfortunately, today the question is not about Africa. The question is about the multilateralism at whole. So the global order on which Africa and the world have relied is undergoing a deep rupture. Multilateralism is under strain. Respect for international law is increasingly selective. Unilateralism, protectionism, and power politics are resurging, while geopolitical rivalries intensify. Global institutions, including the United Nations, face serious crises of effectiveness and resources. These developments are not distant from Africa. They directly affect our peace and security, our development prospects, and the credibility of the multilateral system on which we continue to depend. At the same time, Africa is confronting serious internal challenges. Across the continent, violent conflicts persist and evolve. New forms of insecurity are emerging. Socio-economic pressures are mounting, and democratic governance is under strain in several contexts. Of particular concern is the erosion of Pan-Africanism as a guiding political force in defining continental solidarity, leadership, and collective responsibility. History, however, reminds us that Africa has faced such crossroads before. At the end of the Cold War, the continent chose collective responsibility over-fragmentation, and transform the organization of African unity into the African Union. All of us will remember when, we were in Sirte, 1999, at 9 in the morning when we launched the African Union. But I don't know whether we reach, our expectation and our goal, or I should ask myself and ask all of you the question that has been raised now by Dr. Solomo, whether African Union is relevant or not. This is what we are trying to know from now. Today, we are once again called upon to demonstrate that the same resolve. Africa can no longer afford to be a spectator in a rapidly changing world. The urgency before us is real. Our continent possesses immense strategic assets, including critical mineral essential for the global energy and digital transitions, vast economic potential, and a young and dynamic population. Yet, potential alone does not translate into influence. If Africa remains confined to exporting raw materials and reacting to agenda set elsewhere, it will remain on the margins of global decision-making despite being at the center of its consequences. This is why Agenda 2063 remains our strategic compass. Its vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens and acting as a dynamic force global, speaks directly to our current reality. Reclaiming this vision requires Africa to speak with one voice, strengthen its cohesion, and reinforce its continental and regional institutions. The African Continental Free Trade Area provides a concrete pathway in this regard. By strengthening intra-African trade, developing regional value chains, and supporting industrialization, it can help transform Africa's wealth into sustainable development and meaningful participation in global value-added production. Mesdames et messieurs, on ne peut pas parler de développement sans parler de paix et de sécurité, parce que la paix, la sécurité et le développement sont indissociables. Donc, comment parler de développement à un moment où le terrorisme partout en Afrique sévit, que ce soit en Afrique de l'Ouest ou bien dans la région de la Corne de l'Afrique. Et souvent, nous entendons des discours qui sont un peu déphasés. Parce que ce qui se passe dans la région de la Corne de l'Afrique, on dit souvent que les Africains prennent leurs responsabilités. On dit souvent que des pays comme le Soudan, des pays comme l'Érythrée, des pays comme l'Éthiopie ou bien la Somalie prennent leurs responsabilités. Je veux dire que c'est une position hautement stratégique qui concerne toute la communauté internationale. Si nous prenons le cas de l'Europe, 40% du commerce de l'Europe se fait le reste du monde à travers cette zone, en passant par la mer Rouge et puis le golfe d'Aden, la région de l'océan Indien, en passant par le canal de Mozambique. Si jamais un pays européen qui veut faire du commerce avec l'Australie, avec la Chine, avec l'Inde, et qui ne peut pas utiliser cette route. Pourquoi? Parce que la route est dominée par les Houthis qui sont au Yémen, ou bien les Shabab qui sont en Somalie. Ce pays sera obligé de passer par le nord de l'Afrique, aller jusqu'à Tanger, descendre, passer par l'Afrique de l'Ouest et descendre jusqu'à l'Afrique du Sud pour remonter. C'est un défi. C'est un défi à relever. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous disons que nous sommes tenus à travailler main dans la main. Et je saisis cette opportunité sous le contrôle du représentant spécial du président de la Commission de l'Union africaine, chef de la mission en Somalie, pour dire un grand merci aux Nations Unies pour dire un grand merci à l'Union européenne, pour dire un grand merci à la Grande-Bretagne pour l'appui constant accordé à cette mission en Somalie, la mission de l'Union africaine en Somalie, qui est établie depuis 2007 et qui lutte contre le terrorisme violent dans cette région. Donc, encore une fois, aujourd'hui, la sécurité collective doit être comprise de manière plus large et intégrée. Elle dépasse l'absence de guerre pour inclure la sécurité humaine, la souveraineté économique, la résilience climatique, la sécurité sanitaire et la stabilité institutionnelle. Dans ce contexte, la réforme de la gouvernance mondiale, en particulier du Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, n'est pas symbolique pour l'Afrique. Il s'agit d'une question de légitimité, d'efficacité et d'équité. Un système qui ne reflète pas les réalités géopolitiques contemporaines ne peut assurer une paix durable. Et je tiens aussi à rendre hommage à tous ceux qui œuvrent d'arrache-pied pour qu'il y ait plus de paix, de sécurité et de stabilité dans nos continents, à commencer par nos soldats qui sont, comment dirais-je, en Somalie aujourd'hui, et ceux qui ont servi au Soudan, au Mali, en Centrafrique et ailleurs, mais aussi les Africains, brillants enfants du continent qui ont dirigé ces missions, à commencer par mon grand frère, Monsieur El Khassimouane, qui a travaillé d'arrache-pied au Mali et dans la région du Sahel, mais aussi notre frère, l'ambassadeur Boli, qui est ici aujourd'hui et qui passe beaucoup de temps en Somalie pour qu'il y ait plus de paix et de sécurité. L'Afrique, aux côtés du Sud global, doit continuer à plaider pour un système multilatéral qui reflète le monde d'aujourd'hui et non les configurations de pouvoir du passé. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, l'Afrique n'est pas en retard dans le cours de l'histoire. L'Afrique est au sein de l'histoire et de plus en plus au centre. Ce qui est requis maintenant, c'est la volonté politique de s'affirmer, la clarté stratégique pour agir collectivement et le courage de passer du diagnostic à la décision. Ce dialogue pré-sommet offre un espace opportun d'élection et d'alignement stratégique. Utilisons-le pour réaffirmer le panafricanisme comme identité politique de l'Afrique et boussole directrice et placer un collectif crédible. Sans une Afrique forte, unie et engagée, il ne peut y avoir de sécurité mondiale durable, ni d'ordre mondial équitable. Docteur Salomon, tout à l'heure, j'ai renoncé au titre d'ambassadeur parce que les ambassadeurs sont des gens qui articulent bien. Je me suis dit que je veux le titre de chercheur. Donc, comme ça, on va m'accorder 30 minutes, 1 heure de temps, 2 heures de temps à pouvoir parler et vider tout ce qui est dans mon fort intérieur. Encore une fois, je vous remercie de votre attention et me réjouis de nos libérations d'aujourd'hui. Merci.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Swev. I think the caption, Africa at a Crossroads, is something that we bring together lightly. Many on the African continent, I would imagine, caught up in the crossfires of violent conflict. Many on the African continent who couldn't afford the very basic essentials of putting food in their mouth. Those are the people that we imagine as we put this framing together. And our understanding today is that the situation on the continent, security-wise, politics-wise, socio-economic-wise, and also strategically speaking, is very worrying and troublesome. On the security front, of course, I think it's difficult to, it can't be emphasized enough that we are indeed in what may be considered to be, without exaggeration, in a state of emergency. The kind that Africa faced, for example, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Will Africa and the African Union mobilize the kind of response and collective action that they displayed in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic that the continent faced? I think that is the question that we are also asking. And I think beyond and above referencing to Pan-Africanism as a rhetorical framing, today, in this moment, for the millions, hundreds of millions of Africans on the continent. What future? I would like to ask my senior brother, Abdul Muhammad, a very distinguished mediator, who have been an inspiration for many of us as we were venturing into the world of African Union and peace and security, who is incredibly passionate about Africa, Pan-Africanism, the African Union, and not least of all, of course, the passion that he has for being practical on how to go about responding to the crisis that we face, as he demonstrated through his incredible engagement on the very serious challenge that we face in the Sudan for years, but also most importantly today. I think for this African Union summit, part of the question really is, and that question that I ask whether the African Union is relevant, is basically whether this summit would end up becoming another talking shop where no serious policy action would be adopted to get on top of the unraveling of a very important country on the continent that connects different regions, the Sudan. Abdul, you have the floor, please.
Assalamu alaikum. It works. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Solomon, Amani African colleagues, for the very generous introduction, and also for making it possible for us to meet at this very important juncture, not only for Africa, but also for the globe. And before that, let me say, Excellencies, brothers and sisters, colleagues and friends, I think as it has been said repeatedly, and we may have to repeat some of these things that have already been said, but as briefly as possible, just for the purposes of internalizing some of the concept that should guide us in trying to understand the complexities we are facing globally today and how it manifests itself in Africa. Okay, the global order is not merely changing, that's what people started saying. It is fragmenting, it is unraveling, and this morning I read the report of the Munich Security Conference where they described what's unfolding globally. They said that the world has entered an era of wreck ball politics. That's how the Munich Security Conference, which starts on Friday, described the current global environment. Why? Because great powers are retreating into identity. Middle powers are competing without restraint, and some of them with impunity. Institutions that once claimed universality are weakening. War is mutating in form and meaning. Legitimacy, nationally and internationally, is eroding. In a moment like this, clarity is not extremism, it's responsibility. This is not a transition that can be managed through routine diplomacy or technical adjustments. It is a systemic demolition rupture marked by the collapse of assumptions that governed global politics for decades. Africa confronts this moment from a position of profound vulnerability, but also from a position of historic possibilities. The central question before us is not whether Africa will be affected by this rupture. That's no doubt. The real question is whether Africa will act with clarity, with unity, and purpose, or once again be forced to adapt to an order designed by. Africa has never been a true beneficiary of the so-called rule-based international order. From the age of slavery through colonialism and to the long phase of neo-colonial incorporation, Africa has been positioned not as a co-author of global rules, but as an object to be managed, exploited, or disciplined. Even in the post-Cold War moment, often romanticized as a triumph of multilateralism, Africa largely adopted the global order rather than shaping it. The rules were not written with Africa in mind, yet Africa repeatedly asked to obey them, often at a great cost. But there has also been a measured benefit that we accrued from it because of the stability and predictability that period provided. We tried to milk it for what it's worth. As the Prime Minister of Canada said, it was a useful fiction. It is dangerous because fragmentation, the current rupture therefore carries a double meaning for Africa. It's dangerous because fragmentation and power competition exposes weak states to external manipulation and internal collapse. But it is also an opening because an order in a crisis creates space for new ideas, new coalition, I underline, and new form of agency. Recent shift in global security thinking illustrates the nature of the danger confronting Africa. Migration, for example, has been reframed as an existential security threat. Migration. Not climate collapse, not nuclear proliferation, not genocide, not crimes against humanity. Migration as an existential threat to Western civilization. Okay. So demography is securitized. As a result of that, multilateralism is also portrayed as a weakness rather than as a strength. This is not merely a policy shift. It is a civilizational posture. So as a South African public intellectual said, this posture, current posture, if you look the US National Security Strategy of 2025, which captures some of these issues that I am raising, he says this posture within this security strategy has been described as resembling a doctrine of global apartheid. A framing that captures both its racial logic, and its geopolitical intent. Africa, the implications are severe. This doctrine undermines the continent not only through neglect, but through fragmentation. Bypassing continental institutions at will and with impunity, weakening collective, privileging bilateral transactional arrangement over multilateral coherence, and treating African states as interchangeable units rather than as part of a shared political project. The danger is compounded by the changing war. The nature of war has evolved, has changed. During our times, the choice of weapon was AK-47. Now, the choice of weapon are drones, and the devastation they create should not be lost upon us. Conflict is no longer confined to conventional battlefields. It increasingly includes proxy wars, militias, mercenaries, and privatized violence, sanctions and financial coercion, information warfare and disinformation, and migration control as an instrument of security policy. Exposed to these dynamics because weak and fragmented states become arenas for external competition. This moment of global rupture finds Africa without sufficient leadership, both at the national level and at the continental level, when leadership is most needed. We don't have them. At the national level, many states in Africa suffer from a legitimacy crisis rooted in exclusion, repression, corruption, or prolonged conflict. Leadership is often preoccupied. Current leadership, by and large, are preoccupied with the regime survival rather than national purpose. At the continental level, Africa's multilateral institutions are struggling to provide strategic direction. Pan-Africanism has been highly bureaucratized these days, reduced to procedure. They are reduced to rituals and summit diplomacy, while losing much of its visionary and mobilizing force, politics. Africa's history offers different lessons. Africa has never survived hostile global orders, as most of you repeated today, through fragmentation. It survived through solidarity. Pan-Africanism was not born as a slogan, as a number of you have articulated this morning. It emerged as a political response to system for survival in a world that denied Africa humanity, dignity, and meaningful sovereignty. Collective action, whether through continental institution, regional cooperation, or shared political imagination, has source of agency. The tragedy of the present moment is that Africa's formal political leadership is ill-equipped to rise to the current challenges that we have been talking about. But renewal has never come from governments alone, even historically. Africa's most transformative moments were driven by movements, thinkers, civil society, organized labor, youth, women, and diaspora networks. The next phase of Pan-Africanism must therefore be societal as well as institutional. If Africa is to navigate this moment of rupture with purpose, several commitments are unavoidable, I think. Africa must reassert multilateralism unequivocally as the organizing strategy. Africa must restore political legitimacy as the foundation of security. not security as an end in itself. Africa must resist and continue to resist fragmentation and insist on collective bargaining where possible. Africa must cultivate a new generation of leadership, intellectually sound, serious, morally grounded, and historically conscious. Africa must engage global power without fear and without illusion. Many African people believe today that our leaders are responding to the current global environment with timidity, with defensive measures, and silence. So, whatever institutional limits, if Africa acts now, and this summit is the litmus test, if this summit acts purposefully, this moment can mark the beginning of what we call Africa achieving a strategic autonomy. The responsibility rests with our leadership. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Abdul, for that sobering but also deeply instructive remark that I think situates our conversation and shows the gravity of what we are faced with, but also drawing on history, what we need to do and how that can be done. And that it's not a question of choice whether we do this or not. It's a matter of survival, the choice that we are faced with and the actions that is needed. As Ambassador Swift said, it's not the first time that Africa found itself at a crossroads. It found itself at a crossroads in the period of the 1950s, the transition, and again in the 1990s. On both occasions, Africa rose to the challenge, not at a level that is required, but it did rise. It did rise. So the question now is whether or not Africa once again would rise, this time around to a much more profound, a much more challenging context in which survival, the future of this continent itself is at stake. And I would like to invite us all to take what Abdul has described with the weight and gravity that it needs to be given. It's not hyperbole, it's a fact. For the African Union, there is a history to draw on. And one of those histories to draw on is not just the transition from the OAU to the African Union, but what Ahmed Salim did upon assuming responsibility as the Secretary General of the Organization of African Unity, at a time of another crossroads for the world, the end of quote-unquote history. That was the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the fundamental change that it came up with and its ramifications for the continent. Do we have the leaders? Not just in individual member states, but also at the level of our continental and regional organizations. Our signature report accompanying the AU Summit will come out in a couple of days. It starts with a quote from a renowned poet, William Butler Yeats, The Second Coming. And that poet says, things fall apart The center is not holding. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. That is the moment that Abdul described in his very moving and captivating remark. And with that, we move to the question of how do member states individually feel about and are approaching and positioning themselves, not just individually, but also within the collective of the African Union, and not least of all in the Peace and Security Council. Because that is where, in the Peace and Security Council, in the realm of security first and foremost, which is the founding, are the prerequisite for everything else that the African Union aspires, that directions can be found. And for that, we can't ask for any better representative than Ambassador Hirot, who is the permanent representative of Ethiopia to the African Union and member of this important body, the Peace and Security Council, which in some of the contexts that the continent is facing, as Abdul described, is increasingly sounding challenged. But it has a lot of resources, a lot of possibilities. And I hope this is one of those moments for indeed harnessing those possibilities. And Ambassador, once again, thank you very much. Please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I would like to start by appreciating a lot what Amani Africa is doing and how they are positioning themselves at these crazy days and find a space for us to gather and exchange this on this important agenda. And it's a pleasure and honor to see many of faces that I know here on the podium and around. It's always great to see them. You know, as diplomats, we have a very regimented approach in terms of addressing issues. But it's very tempting to listen to this kind of discussions where you need to let it go free and then express yourself on how you feel about the world is going. I tend to be unnecessarily very optimistic always, I know. So I start with saying that necessity is the mother of invention. I know this is the time that demands very serious thoughts about where the world is going. I remember Chairperson Muhammad Ali Yusuf when he was in one occasion addressing a high-level official. He was expressing where we are. And then, you know, when he assumed his chairpersonship, he was asked, how do you gauge where the world is going? Then it was very expressive. His hands were like this, I remember, and he was saying, we are entering into he was saying, the territory, you can say. This is my second time to appear in Amani's program in a year. And the last session was very interesting. I think our old friend and contact was there discussing about peace building. So I have four-pager here, but it's not relevant when we rush from meetings to meetings and then run to the airport. So I'd like to simply mention very pertinent two issues, and I'll leave some questions to be pondered at. And I am, posing these questions from a very serious soul searching about how the world is faring, how our continent is faring, and how each one of our countries are as well. So most of the things that have to be said have been said. But what can Africa do to position itself in this kind of global situation? Even the very prominent scholar cannot tell us 100% whether we are in a multilateral world, we have entered it or not. I don't want to give examples because you know what I'm saying. Whether some countries have asymmetrical power, or whether there are parallel growths in terms of who's coming as great power, whether the middle powers and the other powers are equated together, it is something for us to ponder on. But for Africa, I believe, first of all, we have to be proud to be Africans because we live in a very rich continent. We live in a very rich culture, and then we live in a very amazing social framework, which is not there anymore in many parts of the world. We have our own social securities. We stand with one another, and then we live our day happily. I believe that's the Africa I have in my mind. I always remember of Bob Marley. When I was coaching recently new cadets, I was just telling them about Africa Unite. And for us, Pan-Africanism is alive. It's very important. Not many people would know when they are Africans, but the sessions that you see every year, without interruption, in the Mandela Hall, deliberating on Agenda 2063 are relevant. So we have to see the world in a flip side. I know many people might see that I'm fantasizing, but that's how I feel. We have made several important milestones. Nobody has expected the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will meet its marks just at the point. I remember in 2020, we launched the Africa Free Trade Area. In 5 years, the trading has started. My country will start to trade soon. That means, a very large trade area in the world will start to function. That's the only solution. If we want to grow in Africa, yes, we have to tackle, as many of the speakers said, the issue of silencing the guns, which has extended by 5 years. But again, we have to also grow. So for us, it's a cyclical thing, but we have managed AFCFTA. We are linking up by air the other, flagship project, which is SATM. The Single African Air Market has been launched. 38 countries have ratified it. We are also connecting by the sky. We need to do more and beyond that. We have a fantastic agriculture strategy, CADAP, which is evaluated every 2 years. My prime minister is champion, by the way. So we mark how we are faring in terms of agriculture. Are we faring well? Not so much. Are we trying? Yes. Are we focusing on the important questions? I said Africa is a beautiful continent. We have a resource. We are pondering on that. Are we thinking of our resources? Of course. We are talking about green minerals strategy against critical raw materials. You know what I mean. So we have a strategy. We are thinking about where we are going. Do we have to hasten up? Yes. Do we have to silence the guns? Yes. Do we have to really achieve the aspirations of African problems, African solutions for African problems? Yes. Is it not working? I do not believe so. We are trying. It will work. There are cases that has worked on, as we well know. So what is then our major challenge in this day and age? I would believe that in terms of the politics, we have to strengthen our African peace and security architecture. It has to be linked very well with African governance architecture because they are one and the same continuum. If we link them together, we start to talk about prevention, the solution for these dire situations that we see around our continent, including unconstitutional change of government, which is now creating a coup belt in Africa. The solution is to think of what we can do in terms of preventive diplomacy. Do we have the right structure? We have enough, but not to an extent that it can manage the conflicts that we see around the world, the problems that we see around the continent, sorry. So there's no other way but to have a better preventive structure. This is what the African Union, I believe, is deliberating on. I just don't want to be formal and, pinpoint the agendas, but I believe we are in a soul searching where we are saying the APSA has served for 20 years and it has to be revolutionized. It's not only to solve problems in Africa, but we were saying the global regime is shifting. We are in a very dynamic tectonic environment. If we want to tackle that, we have to think how we can align the African peace and security architecture with the global narrative. And the continent, how it looks itself, how it positions itself. This is a very critical time. I am among us the believers that necessity is the invention of vice versa, whatever. If there is a problem, there is a solution. So this is at the stage where Africa will have an opportunity, in my view, because there is a new dynamics in terms of together and paving the way. But what I said will not be a reality unless we will have ownership and self-sufficiency in terms of financing. That's for sure. Everybody knows that the African Union has an assessed contribution like any organization, but the budgeting has to improve from our own resources. So we are talking about innovative way of financing. Everyone is saying that's a catchphrase. What does it mean? We have to decipher it. I'll give you the David ethos of the Peace Fund. We said, the Peace Fund was, my senior colleagues know very well, was initiated in the early 90s. It was launched very late, after a decade or so. But African countries have made their targets of rallying $400 million US. Ethiopia is a prompt payer for that. Now we are shifting to thinking of how can we multiply that? How can we multiply it, ring fence it by getting more finance? The Ethiopian Airlines, for instance, has contributed $1 million US recently. That's a small amount, but it's a good start. So we are expanding. We are looking at the private sector. We are more and more getting vibrant financial sector. Afreximbank contributes a lot to the developments in the continent. There are many other things that we can think about. If we think right, we are rich, we are resourceful. It's not about finance and wealth, but also the culture, the mindset. The mindset has to change. If the mindset changes, then of course we have a brighter future. Is the challenge for the continent alone? No. Amani Africa has tried to link he's using a very strong word, disorder, and then also what's going to happen to Africa. All of us have a challenge this time. I don't believe there is a corner in the world that doesn't have a challenge, but the challenge sometimes invents solutions. So for Africa to move ahead, we have a lot of opportunities, but we have to walk the talk. We have good plans, good programs, they have to be implemented. Is it only the problem of Africa? Not at all. It's a global problem. United Nations. So, and Ethiopia, of course, my colleagues in the PSC and Africa believe in multilateralism. how to project the new multilateralism is the key question, I believe. Having said that, I would like to project few questions for you to ponder at. The first one is, how do we recalibrate the AU's role in an era for the erosion of multilateralism, including financing the Union? Two, how do we balance respect for sovereignty with collective responsibility when crises spill across borders? And third, how do we ensure that African positions in global forums reflect shared continental interests rather than fragmented alignments? These are the questions that I want to leave you with to ponder on. But as Bob Marley said, Africa unite. We are a rich continent. It's a rich world. We have to look at it in a positive dispensation. Yes, it could be a level of the crisis that we see. We fear that it might be the level of COVID-19, but we have surmounted COVID-19. And we will definitely surmount the current challenges. So here is a very optimistic view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for injecting a little bit of realism from the perspective of, as you said, a diplomat who is constrained by. But that injection of a bit of realism is also a very important one. But your point that challenge can be a matter of invention, I think speaks to the point that this may be a problem. The problem that we have may be a very good problem and crisis that shouldn't be left unattended. So a good problem that we need to resolve and address. As you rightly pointed out, there are agenda items in the summit that would be reflected upon. I think sometimes the sense of urgency from us comes from looking into and listening to the ground. And there is a sense that the AU appears to be not in sync with how people feel. And that really is basically the perspective from which we come. And in a moment like this one, because indeed the AU has served a purpose for the wider African continent in relation to unconstitutional change of government. It is the only international organization that has a norm that tries to respond to the unique challenge of military coups and other forms of unconstitutional change of government. And that contributed hugely. And also Africa was a pioneer, the African Union in particular, in establishing Article 4H of the Constitutive Act, basically empowering the African Union to intervene in cases of what it calls grave circumstances, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Looking at Sudan, one can't help wondering whether that Sudan, where the AU mobilized strongly to give life to this commitment in 2005 with the deployment of the African Union mission to Darfur, whether that Sudan is going to be where this normative commitment of not to stand by and watch as crimes against humanity, genocidal violence unfolds, would that be the place where AU's commitment would be buried? That is really the question that we need to confront. It is from that perspective that we are coming in feeling unsettled in feeling and pushing hard on the African Union to really not to act in a way that is business as usual. Because there is nothing usual about the current moment, as you rightly pointed out, Ambassador. Thank you once again. And with that, I will move to my dear brother, Murithi, the Africa Director of the International Crisis Group. Thank you for honoring us once again. We fully understand. Thank you for making time. The Africa Director of Crisis Group. Murithi, earlier this morning you launched your annual report on the 8 priorities of peace and security in Africa. And based on that, I think the question really is, what should Africa do and what should the role of the African Union be in that? Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Solomon, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, for coming. I think the beauty of speaking after so many, perceptive speakers is I can just say everything has been said. But I think instead of giving a speech, I'll just give you a series of anecdotes that I think might be illustrative of a few of the threads that we've had earlier among the speakers. Abdul spoke about the history of possibility. Yes, this is a very daunting moment, but we should not forget that Africa in the past has shown a capacity to respond to moments like this. So bear with me as I run through a series of stories which might be challenged one way or the other, but might be illustrative about moments in which Africa has found a solution amid a very contentious, global challenges. So a couple of years ago, Sierra Leone was on the Security Council. It's a relatively small country, not very well known outside the continent, but it was one of the most influential countries we've had from Africa on the Security Council. They were entrepreneurial, they were aggressive, they played alliances, they balanced between poles, between the very difficult East and West. Sometimes getting on the council can be a mixed blessing because you might upset people who you need to be on your side. And one example which my colleagues in New York told us, at one point, and we have the PAM rep of Sierra Leone here, who might correct me if I get anything wrong, but at one point there was a stalemate in the council. They couldn't agree on a text. Especially the Chinese apparently didn't want climate mentioned in one of the resolutions, and especially a link between climate and peace and security. But Sierra Leone took the lead. They lobbied the members, and in fact, when the president of Sierra Leone visited Beijing, he raised it with President Xi, and ultimately, coming from an African state, the Chinese didn't want to accept them. They were very happy to reject it when it came from the West, but they accepted it, and the resolution passed. Another example is Ethiopia being a member of the Security Council. I think it was 2017, 2018. And Ethiopia had a very senior ambassador. Incidentally, he told us they worked very closely with the Egyptians, who I think were also on the council at the time. And they came up with this innovation of trying to fashion a common position among the non-permanent members of the council. These days it's taken for granted, but it was a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of pushing of the African Union. The third example I'll give is my own country when Kenya was on the Security Council. And the PAM rep, Martin Kimani, pushed very hard for the concept of the A3+1, which means that Africa should vote together with the representative of the Caribbean. And those of you, many of you are diplomats, those of you who know the council, the difference between 3 votes and 4 votes is absolutely immense. again, an innovation at the global stage coming from the continent. So pushing back a little more, and apologies to those who heard the story earlier this morning, but we are approaching a very interesting and delicate moment. Last year, apparently, the US didn't contribute to the regular budget of the UN. This year, Congress has passed it. Even last year, Congress passed it, but the budget office refused to send the money. Now, the rules of the UN say that if you don't contribute, a member state that doesn't contribute for 2 years in a row loses their vote in the General Assembly. So I came to learn that in 1964, we were in a similar moment. The USSR, for various reasons, due to all the tensions, didn't pay for 1 year and then did not pay the next year as well. They were due to lose their vote within the General Assembly. But the chair of the assembly at that time was Ghana. And Ghana, understanding that the League of Nations faltered because it lost the support of very powerful members, they decided to look for an innovation. It was a fudge. But what did they do? They decided that for the next year, there would be no vote in the assembly. They would try and resolve everything by consensus. So, it's not a perfect solution, but again, it's an example of Africa innovating and looking for solutions. So I follow the ambassador, I follow the other speakers in trying to say that, yes, this is a dramatic moment. It's a very difficult moment, but it is not a moment to despair. It is a moment to try and think through what the options might be, what the way forward might be, and what the solutions, what creative solutions exist. I would say that, as everybody else said, it's a moment of peril, of course. It's a moment when Africa is not as united as it could be. I think individual leaders perceive opportunity in transactionalism, in dealing individually rather than collectively. Obviously, this is not the wisest approach. It is a moment when Africa's resources are in greater demand than they've been for maybe 100 years, at least since the slave trade, with all the minerals being seen as crucial to the green transition, for example. It is a moment when the necessity of coming together has never been as crucial as it is now. But Africa has the advantage of some sort of collective conscience. I'll give you a small example, which is that when you have the World Cup going on, and maybe Nigeria or Ghana or South Africa or another country are playing, myself in Kenya, Tanzania, or somewhere else, Cape Verde, will just naturally support the African team. I don't imagine that when England are playing, the French will support them because they're all Europeans. So there's this, intangible sense of collective destiny, of collective ties that bind us, that we can really tap into and find a way to exploit and to use to come together as a continent and find a way to resolve them. I think, just summing up, we definitely have to acknowledge the gravity of the moment. We definitely have to see that this is not, it's not a Trump phenomenon. Somebody pointed out that, although he's not eligible, that even if you ended up with President Mamdani, the retreat of the US from the world is probably reversible. It began well before Trump. You remember the famous speech where he said we have to prioritize. We can't be everywhere. We are retreating and will focus on our principal rivalry with the Far East. I think many people weren't listening, and many people are now reacting in shock. But I think that the points that have been made, repeating solidarity, creativity, but above all, standing together, are all very pertinent. It is a difficult moment, but it is one that we should not shirk from. but find creative solutions to confront.
Of emphasizing the need for cohesion, the need for solidarity becomes very important. Whether the African Union and Africa can navigate this challenging moment without a collective strategy. As you said, only through individual leaders looking for opportunities where they benefit from, opportunities in the great scheme of things for a short time, maybe good, but in the long term may actually cost a lot. Thanks again for those reflections. We now shift gear to go more granular and specific. And in that context, I have the pleasure of inviting to the podium His Excellency Ambassador Mike. He is the permanent representative of Sierra Leone to the UN. He is the reason why, Maurice spoke about Sierra Leone's role in the UN Security Council. Sierra Leone just left the UN Security Council. And Sierra Leone's role and experience actually shows possibilities as well, even in terms of some of the questions that people ask about the question of who is going to occupy the seats, the permanent seats for Africa. Everybody looks at the big five or the big countries. And I come and actually said it publicly to Ambassador Mike as well. If Sierra Leone's experience and what it set as an example is anything to go by, there is no reason for insisting that it has to be the big country, simply because it's big. Big, economically and politically, doesn't necessarily translate into being responsible. If today's world shows us anything, being a big power can actually bring about peril as well. But we also have my mentor and senior brother, El Gassimwa, the former SRSG that Ambassador Soif made reference to of the Secretary General and head of the UN mission in Mali. He was the Peace and Security Director of the African Union. And he comes in with an incredibly rich, grounded perspective and experience in terms of speaking to us this afternoon, particularly in terms of also the question of the lessons that Africa can learn from the transition of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. Importantly, the role that Salim Ahmed Salim played in articulating the report of the 1990 to the Organization of African Union Summit on the fundamental change in the world and their implications for Africa, which actually laid the foundation for the 1990 OAU declaration on the same, which became the framing point of reference for the institutional and normative change that happened in the 1990s, and then the transition from the OAU to the African Union. So I would like to invite first Your Excellency El Gassimwa on the question of repositioning Africa and the African Union to the fundamental change in the world, insights from the 1990 OAU Declaration on Fundamental Change in the World.
Okay, much apologies for this. And I think it gives me an opportunity to tell a story. Decades ago, when I joined the AU, I think it was around 1996, but I joined in 1994 as a P2. So I was giving hard time to Ginit, who was the chief of staff of Salim, and I told I need to be promoted. And there was a position of P4 at protocol. So I told him, well, why you don't appoint me as a P4 protocol officer? He said, you're too clumsy. A protocol officer has to be very steady. And indeed, at one meeting, there was a request, oh, could you get water for Salim? So I came with the glass of water, and it all fell. So this is what happened now. And I'm so glad that at the end, I did not take up that position of protocol officer. I think I'm just suited for it. Now, back to the real story. I wish Solomon had alerted me before, because I just worked on the basis of the topic. In fact, I have a speech ready for that topic, but I did it in Accra. I needed to find it, so I was hoping that the ambassador of Sierra Leone will step in, speak first, then I'll find it, but it doesn't matter. You can still read that paper. I think it will be published. I wanted maybe to speak more about the role of Pan-Africanism in African collective security. It also speaks to the points Salim made in his 1990 report. And maybe before I go there, just quickly on that report, Said Ginit, Ibrahim Mayaki, and myself have written a piece a few months ago called the 1990, or it is the 1990 moment. It's available in English and French, so you can read it. There is no point for me repeating it there. But we did make a proposal for the AU Commission, learning from that AU experience, to table a report to the summit. In fact, our proposal was for the AU to do it at this summit on how we can take advantage of the opportunities that exist, but also try to face head-off the risk linked to the changes in the global international system. And we explained where the 1990 report came from, what it did for the AU, what was achieved. And our point is that the AU challenge is not a challenge of norms and vision, it's a challenge of implementation. And again, I insist on it, it's a challenge of implementation and follow-up. And this is what we'll try to say here in a more general terms, but narrowing it to the space of security. Now, let me thank my brother Solomon Derso for taking the initiative of this meeting together with his colleague Atamani, and also for inviting me to contribute to the discussion. I'm also glad to see old faces. Abdul, we did work together way back on a number of issues. Swef, who was my colleague at MINUSMA, but I knew Swef in 1996 when Comoros started experiencing with coups and secession and so on. I was a desk officer for Comoros, so I have worked a lot on Comoros. And of course, Ambassador Hiro, we did work together a lot when I was director of Peace and Security Department. And I'm glad to see my brother Muruti. We never met, but we communicated. And of course, we have many common friends in Crisis Group. Now, I would like maybe just I'll repeat a bit of what was said before, that Africa is facing not simply a difficult moment, I think everyone has emphasized it, but also a structural turning point. I think it's an element we need to keep in mind. And the issue is not really whether the world is messy now, more unstable. It is, everyone agrees. But the real question is, what does a disorderly world mean for African security? I think that's the question I want to answer. And my argument is simple. It was made by the representative of ECOSOC when he spoke. My point is simple. The erosion of the global order is transforming Pan-Africanism from a political aspiration into a security imperative. And I'll explain why. Now, I would like first to say a few words about the changing global environment and why it matters specifically for Africa. In fact, I'm summing up the points we made in that paper. This is a 1990 moment. Many of the trends that are now worrying the world are not new to Africans and to the Global South more broadly. For decades, stakeholders in the Global South have warned about selective application of international law, unilateral action, and power politics. What is really new, what is changing today, is that these practices are no longer framed in ways that try to disguise their true nature. They are naked and they are becoming normalized. And for Africa, this carries a number of consequences. I've identified four. First, recognition of international law and sovereignty and the increasing use of unilateral measures, including force, in pursuit of national interests affect all states, but weaker states are affected more severely. And African countries depend disproportionately on rules because they just lack comparable hard power. So when the rules weaken, obviously vulnerability in Africa increases. Point number two, while the multilateral system was imperfect and unbalanced, and Africa did not design it, we were not in San Francisco, well, we had 4 countries, or 3 in reality. South Africa was under racial domination, but we did not really contribute to action. So while the multilateral system was imperfect, it nonetheless provided some modicum of protection, coalition building, forums to challenges, mediation works, and peacekeeping operations. And today, as those who spoke before me stated, multilateralism is weakening, and it means that Africa is losing diplomatic leverage to advance its interests and conflict management tools simultaneously. Third, declining external support often is framed in developmental terms, but the reality is that it is also a security issue. Why? Because peace operations, DDR, humanitarian support, election support, and even state administration in fragile states have depended heavily on external financing. And fourth, as a result of the heightened geopolitical tensions, African conflicts are becoming internationalized. External actors increasingly shape battlefield dynamics, while African institutions struggle in shaping outcomes, in influencing outcomes. These trends do not only create a more dangerous world, they remove the external pillars that helped African mechanisms function. I think it's an important element. When you look at the African conflict management system as designed in the Peace and Security Council protocol, you would see that it was designed as part of a cooperative international security framework. It's an important element. You look at all the provisions on relationship with the UN and shop partners. We had those elements in mind when the protocol was designed. That framework, that international framework, is now less predictable, less available, and in some cases, internally divided. And the question before us is this one: can African institutions maintain stability if external stabilizers become inconsistent or absent? I think that's the issue we need to address. And this is the crossroad we are approaching as a continent, not a philosophical choice about Pan-Africanism, but a practical challenge of collective security. Now, let me say a few words on how all this intersect with Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism often has been treated as history, memory, or political sentiment. Today, as I indicated earlier, it is of functional necessity for Africa. And in many ways, former President Kwame Nkrumah, in the early 60s, as you all know, he argued that unity was not primarily ideological. It was a condition for sovereignty in an and equal international system. He made it very clear. Now, I will just quote someone who really captured this extreme. Born in Blackness, a fantastic book. I advise all those who have not read it to do so. And recently he published The Second Emancipation. And he writes, I quote, "With no one in the world serving up favors to the continent, Nkrumah's insight about the gains to be had through federation is as salient as ever. What is lacking is sufficient action. The time has come for a continent cut loose in the world to take the next steps." And this is precisely the issue. At the very moment where the international environment is becoming harsher, African states, unfortunately, are increasingly acting individually rather than collectively. We see countries negotiating separate security partnerships with external powers. We see ad hoc external mediation replacing African mechanisms in conflicts. We see bilateral trade agreements, that's a new trend, concluded outside the AFCFTA framework. And we see more broadly a weakening reflex of continental solidarity. Ask the Sudanese, where is African solidarity? So, and the result is predictable. Fragmented bargaining power, unequal deals, and diminished leverage. And in peace and security, it also complicates the search for lasting solutions that require engagement within a coherent continental framework. Now, I did say earlier that Pan-Africanism today should not be about identity. It should be about negotiating power, managing conflicts, and ultimately political survival in a more competitive international environment. Practically, what does that mean? To me, it means 4 or 5 things. First, it means, as Africans, taking our own institutions seriously. Our leaders, and I make this point repeatedly, as someone who worked for 23 years at the OAU, our leaders cannot be more present at summits with external partners than at AU meetings. That sends a message to others and to ourselves. A friend of mine, Desiree Asogbavi, who used to work for Oxfam here in Addis and now is at Open Society, recently remarked, and I quote, "As the world order shifts, summits in foreign capitals make the continent look like a guest at its own table." And that's the reality. And I hope, I don't know how many head of states will be attending the summit this week. I hope we will see all of them, if not the overwhelming majority of them. And believe me, it makes a difference. If African leaders come in big numbers, spend 2 days discussing African issues, something will come out of it. Second, Pan-Africanism and collective security means also cooperating fully with African conflict management institutions. Africa, I think someone mentioned it earlier, has one of the most elaborate peace and security architecture in the world. We have the norms, we have the institutions, and we have the intellectual brain power and the expertise. The PAC protocol is explicit. Member states are expected to support and cooperate with African efforts to resolve conflicts. This does not mean excluding partners, absolutely not. Our crises are connected to global dynamics, but external support should reinforce African leadership, not replace it. Third, Pan-Africanism itself made at the launch of the Peace and Security Council here in Addis on 25 May 2004. Basically, they said that from there on, no African conflict should be out of bounds for the AU, and when grave abuses occur, Africa should be the first to speak and the first to act. And if we do not act when tragedies unfold on the continent, we should not be surprised when others step in. Fourth, collective security does not mean isolation. It requires close partnership with the United Nations. Already in 1990, in his seminal report on the fundamental changes taking place in the world, Salim Ahmed Salim argued that Africa must strengthen its internal capacities while continuing to rely on the UN as the principal multilateral forum through which the continent can defend its interests internationally. That remains true today. And finally, collective security in a renewed quest for Pan-Africanism is also a question of responsibility. It means that everyone in the AU ecosystem, government, must recognize the seriousness of the moment. Africa is entering a more demanding international environment. Routine approaches will not suffice. This period requires commitment, discipline, and political will. And of course, even though myself and many other Africans I'm no longer working at the EU, we all have a responsibility to share ideas with the EU in support of its efforts. Now, you would often ask, how do you turn these slogans into a reality? Because that's the real issue. And often, people would say, well, there is no political will. That's the argument I always hear. Member states are not showing political will does not drop from the sky. It has been generated, and you can generate it. There are ways of generating political will, and we can do it. And paradoxically, precisely because political will is in short supply, it makes the role of the AU Commission, which is not only an administrative body, even more consequential, no less. In fact, they have a much bigger role today than they would have had political will been in full supply. In periods of geopolitical transition, institutions matter most. Political will has to be generated, encouraged, and nurtured. And the Commission must act as the engine of collective action. It must engage proactively its member states, build coalitions around sensitive issues, and create the conditions in which states feel both empowered and compelled to act. I would conclude by saying that the world is not simply becoming more dangerous, it is less structured. For Africa, the consequences are clear. External stabilizers are weakening, and internal vulnerabilities are rising. The question before us is not ideological. It is whether African states will face insecurity individually or manage it collectively. And Pan-Africanism in this context is not about identity, it is about survival and agency. And Africa can either become an arena where global competition plays out or an organized actor capable of shaping its own security environment. And the decision that will be taken this week, in the year ahead, will determine which of the two it becomes. Thank you.
We have a situation whereby Abdul put it, the leadership crisis facing the continent is enormous. And the response to that Abdul also provided is the need for the wider African public to step up. And added to that, now one also emphasized the need for the African Union Commission to actually step up and fill in the space that is left and play that role through the kinds of experiences and the kinds of approaches that delivered previously. And what that means is basically you need really to actually articulate that technical competence and fineness that is required, that strategic thinking that is necessary, and of course, nudging and facilitating negotiation and indeed extracting consensus from member states. These are all the kinds of responsibilities that the African Union Commission need to step up to if it is going to help with and contribute to the African Union and Africa navigating this moment, at least in terms of minimizing the sharp edges of this dangerous time. One of the tools from which the African Union and African countries indeed draw lesson from is the A3 plus arrangement that has been established in the United Nations Security Council. Africa always had, for a long time, for decades, 3 members in the UN Security Council. But it was only during the last decade and a half that they came to operate as a collective bloc, for which they have come to be recognized as a power within the UN Security Council. And how did that come about? El Ghasim One is here, and the former Commissioner for Peace and Security, it was Ambassador Lamamra as well. And it came about in response to a major crisis that the African Union faced. And that was in relation to the crisis, the consequence of which Africa continues to feel to this day. And it's difficult to say that we have seen the light at the end of that difficult tunnel. And Ambassador Michael was I said was because your membership has come to an end. Not because you have ended your permanent representative role into the UN to the UN. It's just your membership in the UN Security Council. But he served in the UN Security Council, and he has experienced many other things. One of which Muruti described, but another of which was actually in relation to the Sudan file. I'm sure you'll tell us stories from that as well, because on Africa, the conventional wisdom was that the big powers that do not see eye to eye on many files would allow the African members, the African Union, to actually put on the table how to deal with it. And one of those files, the most important file at the moment for the continent, particularly for this region, is the Sudan file, as you know. And end of 2024, there was a resolution on the table of the UN Security Council. And that was a seminal moment because it was vetoed. And this, I think, tells us a story about the moment that we are in. And from a very exemplary experience that you have had, that defied the characterization of Sierra Leone as a small country, but actually helped to project African voice in an incredibly exemplary way, including in really moving the agenda of the Idulweni consensus as the leader of the African Committee of 10 Heads of State and Government. Ambassador Michael, you have the floor. Thank you very much for honoring us with your presence and for sharing your reflections.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Dreso, dear Solomon, dear Brother Solomon, for firstly the kind invitation by Amani Africa to be here. It is my first Amani Africa event in Addis Ababa. I participated in one of your events in New York. The thing about inviting me is that After my first appearance, you always get to invite me again, so I hope to be engaging in your sessions. I also want to thank you and Money Africa for your engagement with Sierra Leone during our tenure in the Security Council. And importantly, when called upon to brief, I think you briefed the Security Council excellently on the situation in South Sudan. And I hope your briefing and our engagement on South Sudan will continue to provide a framework and a roadmap for the present members of the Security Council, including the A3+. Now, it is always hard to be the last panel. It is not by design. Even the best wishes of AU Chief of Staff SRSG Wayne could not be granted in wanting me to speak before him. But I think it's fitting that I'm the last speaker, given what we've had. From the rich strategic keynote from the ambassador and researcher, Swerf, to indeed the very strong diagnosis and also call to action by senior strategic advisor, Abdul Mohammed. And certainly the stories we've had from my brother, Muturi. And I think that the questions which Ambassador Zemeni asked are some of the things which we reflect on. I'm also grateful to my brother Solomon because of his introduction to my address or intervention. He has helped me to skip some of the foundational aspects of the A3+, including the reason why we do have the A3+, responding to the crisis in Libya in 2011. And so when it came to the establishment of the A3, and what now also known as the A3+, whenever we have a member from CARICOM, which is the Caribbean community, the 6th region, if you look at the AU Constitutive Act, it tells you that indeed we reacted to the 2011 crisis. This was established in 2013, but in our period of consolidation. And his introduction really saves me the aspect of going through the introduction. I was also going to refer to a very important and useful paper that was done by the counterpart of Amani Africa, the Security Council, that is Security Council report. Again, it was done by one of our brothers that who Ethiopia when they were in the Security Council, really giving a very good descriptive and analytical work on the foundation of the A3+ and what we've been able to achieve. So I'll just briefly go back to 2013 and really summarize the objective of the establishment of the A3+, which was really to amplify the African voice, to consolidate African engagement in the Security Council. And this has manifested in 3 concrete ways. Firstly, joint statement. In 2024, when we were in the Security Council with Algeria and Mozambique, joined by Guyana as the plus, we delivered 106 joint statements. Now, when you go back into the concept behind this, it means that 4 member states of the Security Council gave up their right to sovereignty to speak as an individual member state, and then agreeing to a joint statement, which is not easy in the Security Council, by the way, with all of the pressures. And this was done for 106 occasions. Now, we surpassed that in 2025, when, of course, Somalia replaced Mozambique, Sierra Leone, Algeria, and Guyana continued. So indeed, when it comes to joint statement, we've consolidated this idea that the 3 African members of the Security Council, the A3, and wherever we have a CARICOM member, the plus, can speak as one. That is, of course, amplifying the voice because it carries weight. The second point is also about negotiations. And certainly, it is now the practice that the A3+ or the A3 coordinator will negotiate on behalf of the other members of the A3 or A3+. And so we have a structure in which we have a quarterly coordination. And when we had the plus, it was very easy. And for the first time in 2025, Guyana coordinated the A3+. That is the solidarity and the faith and the plus, because it used to be 3 months for the African members, and then we share 1 month in every last quarter. But last year, we agreed that it was important that Guyana be given the opportunity to coordinate, and so we coordinated for 3 months. So it is that coordinator that will negotiate on behalf of the A3+ member. Again, a concrete manifestation of the challenge in 2011, the conceptualization of the A3+ in 2014, and its consolidation by the end of 2025. So when we served in the Security Council from 1st January 2024 to 31st December 2025, we did so, as I said, with Algeria, Mozambique in 2024, Somalia in 2025, and Guyana. You know, from what has been said this morning, our experience confirms a hard truth, and that is the charter-based collective security. And I put it mildly in my slide, in my paper, to say it is under strain. In the World Economic Forum, the Prime Minister of Canada said it is a rupture. And of course, today, we've been informed of the Munich assessment using the wrecking ball. And so this is the context in which we concluded our tenure in the Security Council. Yet, with the system in a nuanced way under strain, or of course under rupture, it remains indispensable. And this is the case not only for African states, and I take the point on the issue of how the system was initially designed not based on the African agency, in which, of course, we are compelled to implement and accept. But also, I think the system has been a very good instrument, and as was said, for credibility, for predictability, and consistency. And I think it will also to ensure that we're able to salvage the system. So the lesson is not to abandon the international law-based multilateral order. It is to make it work with stronger regional agency, I will argue, credible coalitions, and of course, principle consistency. And so for our 2 years in the Security Council, we advanced a principle-based, partnership-driven, and representative approach to global peace and security. And we focused on the African agency. That is including framing discussions and the attention of the Council, but also in African leadership. And I'll come to the issue of coordination and cooperation, because I see in the room a very good friend, and we spent 1 year together in the Council. And I'll come to the issue of the presidential statement on UNOAS, in which we co-pen with Switzerland. But I think it's important for me to mention that we worked with Switzerland on that issue in achieving the outcome that we achieved. But I'll come to that. I think there's a place for that in my intervention. And so I need not repeat that we are witnessing certainly an erosion of the things which we all know. The international law-based order, erosion of restraint, now might is right, selective application of international law and rules. We are normalizing unilateralism, and certainly there is over politicization of Security Council outcomes. The result, as we now see, is a weakened collective security scheme of the Council, and certainly reduced deterrence. And this is particularly when we have the major power divisions that we see. Yet, has been said already by other speakers, this moment creates an opening for Africa to recalibrate on how we'll organize ourselves, influence delivery of the Security Council. And so I would have spent my time to really explain to you the establishment and all the nuances of the A3+, but I've framed my intervention to fit the topic for the day, Africa at a crossroads. And I will suggest that this moment in time offers us opportunity to deepen African solidarity and coordination, not only in New York, but also in Addis Ababa, and certainly between Addis Ababa and New York. We see a role for greater global engagement on principles by African member states, including the A3, certainly on African files. There is room for smarter navigation of the multipolarity that we see. And of course, we have to deal with this issue of middle powers. We say we now live in a multipolar world. What does that mean for Africa, and how do we deal with the middle powers? And certainly, there is opportunity for credible reform and subsidiarity. Credible reform in the context of the Security Council reform and the role of Sierra Leone as the coordinator, of the Committee of 10 African Heads of State, Government on the Reform of Security Council, and certainly in the application of Chapter 8 of the UN Charter on regional arrangement, which of course will invoke the principle of subsidiarity and the role of the African Union. And so the key argument will be, if the global order is fragmenting, Africa must integrate, certainly politically, diplomacy, and in our operations at the technical level. So our voice is unified, and our solutions are not only funded, but they will remain legitimate and effective. I think it speaks also to the issue of funding African solution, which will be critical in the future. So let me briefly go to the first opportunity, which I think offers itself in this current state that we find ourselves. That is the consolidation of African solidarity, and in the context of the Security Council, through the A3 and the A3+. The A3, as we now have discovered, is not just a coordination tool. From 2011, 2013 to 2025, we now instrument for African agency. And I'll give some example of this African agency. Concrete cases. I know I'll be speaking at the edge of being a diplomat and, of course, speaking on issues which normally we will not venture into. The one example will be the conflict in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Of course, for a very important AUPSC meeting in the last summit, which I think it was a very good example of elevating critical issues. It was on the DRC and Sudan. Now, when we first addressed the file in the Security Council, and we chaired, and I chaired the 1533 Committee concerning the Democratic Republic of Congo, the focus, mostly two. One, the orderly withdrawal of MONUSCO, that is the UN peacekeeping mission in MONUSCO, because that was the thinking after Mali, MINUSMA, and also this issue of misinformation and disinformation. However, at the same time, we had two important processes that were ongoing, peace processes. They were mandated by the region, by the African Union appointed His Excellency President João Lorenzo of Angola as the African Union mediator, and so he started the Luanda process. And we had former President Uhuru Kenyatta, who was the mediator and started the Nairobi processes. But in the engagement at the Security Council, these processes were missing, and these were the peace processes. And so when we engaged the affected countries, what we decided to do as an A3+ was really to elevate these processes, to look at the concrete measures, of course, ensuring that we're able to get to a peace process, support the peace process, and hopefully get the parties to agree in a peace agreement. Investment by those African member states. So President Lorenzo was not only leading the process, Angola was investing in convening and holding meetings at various levels, operational levels, at the ministerial level, and the hope was to convene at head of state level. And so there was shuttle diplomacy at that. We agree on important milestones. First, the very first ceasefire that was announced by the parties, that is the government and M23, but also the involvement of Rwanda. There was the commitment for the neutralization of the FDLR, the concern of Rwanda, but also disengagement of forces. That is the withdrawal of defensive measures on the part of Rwanda. They agreed to operationalizing what they call a monitoring mechanism in which you have both Rwanda and the personnel. And so these mechanisms were set up through the Luanda processes, but they were not being featured in the Security Council process. The first attempt was to get Angola to brief on this process. It wasn't possible because of the meeting format of the Security Council. So what did we do? We invited the foreign minister of Angola to come to a lunch with Security Council members to explain exactly what was going on in the Luanda process. As chair of the 1533 committee, I led a regional tour of the committee for the first time to Angola, because we were there to support the peace process, and then to DRC, to Rwanda, and Uganda. This also ensured that we brought to the fore an important peace process. Now, the final agreement was not reached because, of course, the two heads of state could not travel to Rwanda to conclude the agreement. But what we now see in the Washington D.C. agreement is essentially the important work that was done in Luanda. That is the African agency and leadership which we brought to the fore, which was ongoing, but not certainly at the center of the work of the Security Council. And there may be many examples. I can go to the issue certainly of reform, which was brought by Sierra Leone for the very first time in the Security Council, when we had a debate during our presidency in August 2024 on Security Council reform, having the positions of all the members of the Council, particularly the P5, on the issue on record, the issue of counterterrorism, focusing on the Sahel, but also, of course, in the Horn of Africa, that was led by Sierra Leone, Algeria, and certainly Somalia when it joined. Peace and development, that was led by Guyana. So the issue of agency was quite instrumental. So the A3 Plus became for African agency. So we see increasingly cohesive action on voting and negotiation, as I've mentioned. The A3 Plus mechanism was an expansion in 2020 and 2021 when St. Vincent and the Grenadines joined, which has been followed by Guyana. The other point which I want to talk about briefly in terms of this agency is pen holdership. There's been increasing call for pen holdership. What is pen holdership? Who drafts the resolution? There is a lot of influence a pen holder would wield in the Security Council because you frame the decision, you frame the discussion. And it is not a normal negotiation wherein you listen to everyone and you find, of course, that is the role of a facilitator, but in the Security Council, you have a pen holder. And you have a pen holder, in most cases, that is a permanent member, and a pen holder that can wield so much influence to get the 9 votes. So the dynamic is slightly different from normal negotiations and product. But the product I wish to talk about is peace consolidation in West Africa and UNOS file, because we certainly work with Switzerland as co-pen holders, and that is the collaboration across regions, so cross-regional cooperation that is important. Because you mentioned China, the Chinese position to climate security was quite nuanced. They were linking climate to development. We have other members of the Security Council, they were looking. So for them, climate security is not a direct threat, and so there was no support for the thematic approach to this. And I think you would not win any prize for guessing what member state is that. And of course, you have those of us that supported the climate security nexus. I think it is something that is rooted certainly. And we worked with Switzerland across the divisions to be able to get to a position where we got the council to agree after almost a 3-year impasse. I think it's one of the few decisions in the council in which there was applause after the adoption. You don't get that in the Security Council. And that is the spirit of collaboration. I see Solomon looking at his watch, so I think I have to speed up and move to the other opportunities. I wanted to talk about how the A3 Plus has been grounded in terms of its consolidation. We have a guiding principle that guides how we engage and reach agreed position in terms of working methods. The African Union Permanent Observer Mission is the secretariat, so there is opportunity for institutional memory since the composition of the council will change every year, and certainly in terms of tenure every 2 years. So what's the second opportunity in trying to at least conclude my intervention on the opportunities which I've highlighted? It is the opportunity for for Africa to shape global agenda on the basis of principles and to engage in conflict beyond Africa. And we've seen that throughout our tenure in 2024, 2025, in which Africa's legitimacy has grown when we apply our principles consistently, not only on African files, but on all files that the Security Council will get to engage in. So increasingly, certainly led by Algeria, the situation and the conflict in Gaza, on Haiti, led by Guyana, on Myanmar, on Afghanistan, on Syria, in which the objective of the A3 Plus was not to take sides, was certainly to ensure that we insist on principles. And for me, it was really a great delight. After the council, after the 2nd January removal of President Maduro, and then the realization that I don't have to go to the council to explain, to see the A3 delivering a joint statement on the issue, focusing on principle. That is the consistent application of principles, the consolidation of the African influence, that we can speak on Venezuela, we can speak on Iran, non-proliferation on the basis of principles. So that is the second opportunity, and this must continue. Now, let me go to the third opportunity so that, and I think speaking on principle, maybe just to the point which you made, Solomon, to refer to some of the principal issue, this issue of protection of civilians, respect for international law, respecting peaceful settlement of dispute and accountability. In Sudan, we were confronted with this issue and the principle of non-indifference in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Approach the Sudan issue, of course, with the atrocities which we see in our very eyes. Sierra Leone agreed to co-pen with the traditional pen holder, United Kingdom, to put forward a resolution on the basis of the agreement of the parties. They've agreed to the protection of civilians. So it wasn't new. It was essentially calling the parties to implement their agreement. But that was vetoed. Again, an African issue that became a subject and a victim of geopolitical rivalries. So that is the context in which we operate. But I wanted to say that even within that context, we're able to make our point clear on the issue of respecting the principles, and of course, in calling for accountability, including the extension of the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Now, the third issue I wanted to highlight briefly, because it's something that we confronted in the Council, is managing this multipolarity and, of course, engaging with middle powers. We do have opportunities to engage with the middle powers. We've seen middle powers that are really interested in pursuing peaceful settlement of dispute, seen as agent of mediation and engagement. But also, we've seen middle powers that can be described as conflict entrepreneurs. They are also engaged on the issue of resource competition and illicit flows of finance and weapons. We've seen the weaponization of misinformation. We've seen the exploitation of governance gaps around critical minerals. And I agree with SISG Chief of Staff Wayne on the issue of ensuring that we are organized. The A3 Plus is an example of that organization. But at the continental level, there is a greater role, and I see engagement already by the AU chairperson in the course of the year, engaging with these middle powers, because we need to transform them from entrepreneurs of conflict and spoilers to positive agents for peace. But there is great risk, but I'll move on. That is a very turning question at the time, and I don't want to get into naming names, but I'm sure you know them already. And so the fourth opportunity is reform. The question of the reform of the Security Council, in which the argument has been made that the most important innovation in the Security Council in recent times is the A3 and the A3 Plus. And certainly, parts of the achievement in terms of the landmark resolution is 2719, and the role of the A3 in that. And the A3 is a clear demonstration of how effective a permanent African member can be in the Security Council. I think that has been demonstrated, particularly in a difficult time. And so when we had a debate on Security Council reform, it was really to move forward this agenda item. And this present state of paralysis presents the opportunity for us to move ahead in this agenda. And I take this opportunity to state that at this summit, at this assembly, the C10 coordinator, His Excellency President of Sierra Leone, will present his report, and in a draft decision, there will be the African Union model, which would then, if adopted, and I hope it is adopted, will provide the opportunity for us to submit it in the intergovernmental negotiations. And of course, we can then push for the co-chairs to develop the in the Pact of the Future, in the Summit of the Future in 2024. The second point is really about subsidiarity. Chapter 8, the African Peace and Security Architecture, and Africa can continue to be effective in this present state of paralysis or global rupture. And I don't want to get into the point in which has been made already, but I subscribe to the point that we need a reconceptualization of our approach to security, certainly collective security, but one that is focused inwardly on people and of course on the various dimensions of security, human security, so that will include climate, peace and development nexus, building through the regional economic communities, so through the REX. I hope, Solomon, that you have a space for your paper, because I'm hoping to submit something on this new approach to the African approach to the collective security scheme that we have presently and the use of Chapter 8. So I think in concluding, and I really beg your indulgence for the time that I've taken, my call is for Africa to look inward, certainly to build our capacity. I think that has been said. African peace and security architecture, the relations between the African Union and the REX in terms of early warning, mediation, peace support operations, and governance reliance. And Africa should remain relevant outwards. And this is where the A3 will continue to play an important role. Principled diplomacy, coalition building, and consistent engagement on global crisis. The strategic end state should be African solutions should be stronger, African solutions should be funded and operationalized. African diplomacy should remain united. In that way, it will be influential. Global relevance is maintained through principled consistency and practical problem solving, including the application of the principle of non-indifference. In this context, I will end, particularly in Sudan. I thank you.
As you can see, the interventions and presentations are not philosophical or hypothetical. They are very concrete, they are very relevant and responsive to the current moment and based on and informed by contemporary experiences. Ambassador, we will publish. All that you have to do is basically press the button and send it. You are most welcome. So if I insist on you sending it and bothering you with that, you invited me, so I am accepting the invitation. Actually, we will avail of the panel. It is now that time when you, as my grandmother, who was actually my mother, used to say, whenever I invite somebody or people and family to the house, it's always great when they actually enjoy what is served. Now is the time for you to really reflect on, ask questions, and show your response and reaction to what has been said. Okay, I will start with my other mentor, Ambassador Rui, and you are most welcome to you. And then, yes, from India, I'll come to you. And of course, if there are also our participants online who would like to intervene, let us know.
Thank you. Just points. The first relates to one of the panelists indicated that the rules-based system of the past did not reflect well in Africa, did not benefit Africa. A later panelist indicated that the weakening of the rules-based system has also weakened African multilateral action. We need to come to an understanding as to what the benefit of the rules-based system was, if any, and if not, to reflect on the fact that maybe we haven't gained anything from it, and so finding ways of dealing with the new coming system is what we should focus on. The second point relates to references to middle powers. I think everyone spoke about middle powers that are active in Africa more and more. we need to understand that middle powers are here because member states have invited them to participate in their political activities and in their relations with their member states. So just blaming middle states is not enough. It is something that has come also out of Africa. So we need to have a critical approach to our own member states who made it possible for middle powers to be active rather than blaming middle powers for being active on our continent. What is the gap in the continent that has made the middle powers so attractive to some of our countries? What is the gap that is on the continent that has propelled us to dealing more with middle powers as mediators in our own disputes? This is what I wanted to ask to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that just before you move, can I give you the mic if you have any parting shots? Thank you very much, Morit.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really sorry I have to run because I have to catch a flight. But just, I think overall everything has been said. I think the point Ambassador Hiroi raises is very pertinent because we often analyze the issue of middle powers on the continent in a way that ascribes agency primarily to the middle powers. But we have to remember, I've always watched, for example, Somalia's elections. Somalia has a real asymmetry with the middle powers. But the Somali politicians actually play the powerful Gulf actors against each other. And if you watch every election, one election, a Qatar is elected, and in the next one, a UAE-friendly president follows it. It has been quite a pattern. But what's the gap? I think the gap is a failure of instruments of collective security on the continent. I think there's been a failure of a capacity to build some understanding among member states. I think that we must not romanticize the past too much, but in recent years, there's at least what some call just a settlement, if not to agree on how to resolve disputes, but how to manage them. And now a gap has arisen where these external actors with their own interests are able to fill the gap. Just very quickly, I remember going to one Gulf country, and it was in the years after Obama made his retreat from the rest of the world speech. And they said, look at that map. The Horn of Africa is what they called our strategic periphery. The American security umbrella is gone. We are going to come in and fill it. And at that time, I didn't take it seriously. But I think they were thinking strategically. I don't think people on this part of the continent were thinking in the same way about what might come next. So I think it's a collective challenge which we have to face and think through. But thank you very much, Solomon, for hosting us.
Thank you so much, Moretti. Really wonderful always to listen to your interventions, and also thank you for making time to be with us and safe flights. Thank you again. Please.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you for organizing this very interesting panel. I listened to the presentations, and thank you for all the panelists. I'd like to ask a few questions and so comment a little bit more on the presentation by my brother Abdul. Your passionate presentation hits very hard. But I want to bring your attention to, Abdul, when you talk about, because I want us to reflect on how we can reconcile the call for Pan-Africanist multilateralism with the fact that many African states today are the architects of their own violence. That includes my own country here. So if we can, talk about collective security, And can this kind of architecture be built by state infrastructure that's predominantly pivoting towards violence itself? Or can Pan-Africanism be built against state-centric approaches or without state-centric approaches? And what should be happen if we are aspiring for that? Can another rupture be possibly considered to separate the building of Pan-Africanism from state infrastructure in Africa? When it comes to your presentation with the AU, there as well, if we can, the agenda itself talks about the African Union itself being built fundamentally on the global world order, on the post-World War global order. If we can talk about the AU's existing institutional capacity, can that be separated from its own foundational principles so we can aspire for something better that doesn't depend on the global order? Should we not first rupture its own foundational structures if we wanted to consider a better approach on this regard? Abdul, floor is yours.
I have recognized a lady there, and then I'll come to the representative of India, and then the lady in front.
All did. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Magdalena. I'm from Tanzania, and thank you, first of all, for all this discussion that we have been having today. I'm glad that we're discussing Pan-Africanism, but also security in general. And we keep discussing since morning the importance of Pan-Africanism, and I'm glad that some of the panelists that have been presenting today, they keep highlighting the need of governance. They keep showing where we're failing. And I love the fact that Madame just mentioned right now as well, the role of African Union. And lately, majority of the youth in Africa, they keep asking themselves one question: is AU fit for its role? Because we can keep talking about security while we have African countries who are being invaded, they're having internal conflicts, but the UN doing anything about it. When are we going to address the issue in Congo? When are we going to address the issue in Libya? When are we going to address the conflict in Sudan? When are we going to address the things that are happening in Nigeria? We have foreign nations that want to invade in Africa to take control, to try to resolve our problems, and we have AU. Is it just an institution, like she was saying? Is it that powerless? And if it is, why do we still have it? Because the ship sink, like the ship, that famous say that says the ship floats on water, but then it only collapses when the water enters it, right? But then here we are, we're in Africa. The biggest thing that has been happening right now is lack of security. We speak about security and peace, but to whose context? Whose peace are we referring to? Whose security are we referring to? If we have the same African countries who are actually struggling when it comes to peace and security, and we're not doing anything. When we talk about Pan-Africanism, if we are going to have leaders who do not embed in the principles of Pan-Africanism, of Africans for Africa, of protecting Africa and its resources, why do we still have them? Why do we still endorse them? Why are we even sitting here and not addressing the critical issues that we're actually facing right now? Why do we promote the Africans leaders who do not embed this principle? Because for us to advance, to get to where we want to go, we need to actually have leaders who have Africa interest at heart. Not by portraying it in a complex and speaking, because from morning we keep discussing the policies. We have beautiful structure. We look at the AU structure, it's gorgeous, it's beautiful. But when it comes to implementation, it's only 20%. And for how long are we going to keep running and having this and review policies and reforms and not get the point?
So, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Vinesh Chintaram. I have some Indian origins, I would say, but I'm a true Mauritian and African. So I'm the chairperson for Infrastructure and Energy Cluster at the level of ECOSOC. So I'm allowing myself to ask a question on behalf of my colleague, the PO who is not here, and the head of secretariat. As a chair of infrastructure and energy, two simple questions. Can water and energy stress become a peace and security trigger serious enough for the AU Peace and Security Council to treat it at an early warning priority, as an early warning priority? And what concrete actions or precedents exist? I take one example. My neighboring country, Madagascar, if you followed what happened, so it started by some kind of revolts from the population because they were asking for power, electricity, and water. We are sitting in that room, and we know how many times the power went off. So imagine what's happening there. So that's one. The second question, very brief as well. We talk a lot about intra-African connectivity. Well, actually, that's one of my specialty as an architect and urban planner, but also territorial planning specialist. CFTA, we talk a lot about trade. It's gaining momentum, slowly but surely, and I'm positive about it. The question is, if minerals can move in heavily secured corridors for export beyond the continent, okay, then why can't Africa secure corridors of life? Why can't Africa secure routes to get access to water? This is the theme of the year. I've not heard much about that. And we are discussing it for quite a while, and that's going to be the subject. So for those minerals who have huge value, seems like African lives doesn't matter much. So simple questions, I believe they are simple answers also. So I look forward for practical response to these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Protecting corridors of life. I think if you think about it, the conversation about events in Sudan and what needs to happen is basically exactly that. But I'm sure the members of the panel will give their reflections. Let's go back to, yes, the lady at the back. If you kindly introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Good evening, because now I'm seeing it's 10 to 5. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kanya Bonani. I work for the South African Broadcasting Corporation. My question, there was a speaker earlier who had raised that we should have a call to action around mobilizing and coordinating on the continent, especially around issues of peace and security. My question becomes, how do we do so in a time and an era where suppression is being used as a tool to silence not just civil society or the media, but anybody who has anything constructive to say in rebuilding, not just the African Union or member states themselves, but also in a time where we're also navigating things like internet shutdowns in election periods, outside of election periods. We're also dealing with how both of these instances that I've raised have created new insecurities. And I think something we haven't spoken about enough is what happened in Madagascar in the last year, and how I absolutely adore the Gen Zs. The Gen Zs are really starting to challenge how to not collectively protest or collectively change government and come together, but they're also making us question what are the new threats to insecurity. Because now you have governments who all of a sudden, when they don't want you to hear about what's really happening in their country, can switch off the internet at the dial of a button. The fight that South Africa is having with Starlink goes beyond Elon Musk's citizenship. It has everything to do with who has control of digital telecommunications and technologies, and how are they going to use it against us when we want to rise up and speak to issues that are uncomfortable, that are undesirable, and challenge the status quo. We can't speak about security and not be responsive to what is happening now especially when we don't recognize the safeguards that are required to ensure that we can mobilize, that we can coordinate again. Because that is at the heart of the new insecurity of this era, of this, well, let's say 5-year period, because COVID did create a new environment politically for quite a lot of African countries. But if someone, and all three of you can take a hack at it, but it's something that we're not recognizing because everyone keeps saying technology will help us do A, B, and C. But when it is weaponized against us, what happens then?
Thank you very much for that question. I'll come to you, Shawit, and then there was an online request as well. So Shawit and then the online request, and then back to the panel.
Thank you very much, Amani Salomon, for organizing this very insightful dialogue. I want to ask about incentives. And we talked a lot about, Pan-Africanism and collective action. And I think when we speak about Pan-Africanism, I think citizens understand and know their collective destiny and also identity, as Morithi was saying earlier, exemplifying with football. But what's the incentive, for African elites and decision makers to choose this collective action? On security, maybe, but on political and economic situations as well. When you compare it against, outcomes against short-term political and economic gains, what does AU to offer to incentivize African leaders to actually decide to have a more collective decision and action? Because it's not a rational choice, I don't think. It's a rational choice rather than a moral one at this point, or an ideological one, as you were talking about in the 50s or 60s. So yeah, that's the question, basically. Thank you.
Rational choice, not a moral one. Let me come to my sister here, and then, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually about to give up. My name is Amina Yahya, and I'm with the Young African Activist Network. Thank you so much to the panelists for your contributions. It's been very, very interesting. And at one point when Ambassador El Ghazim was speaking, he said when he joined the African Union in 1994, and I said to myself, oh, I wasn't even born then. So it's been very, very interesting conversations, and a whole lot has been said about the issues of, weak and fragmented state, the global breakdown of order, and then the issue of funding as well, and multilateralism. So what I want to say is we are seeing a rise in transactional, what you would call transactional Pan-Africanism, where member states are aligning, building relationships with emerging powers for the purpose of survival rather than collective values. And we are also seeing a shift from the traditional UN peacekeeping missions to more regional, like the SADC, EAC, and the likes of that. So based on the theme of collective security, my question is for Ambassador Abdul Mohammed. Does this shift strengthen the agency of Pan-Africanism, or are we at a risk of a security situation where regional interests are going to supersede continental stability? Thank you.
Thank you. Tefi, I'll give you the floor, and if you can also come. There is an online question, and then the mic will come to you.
Okay, the first question that was asked from our online participant is, how can be Pan-Africanism, I'm reading it as it is, be created at least regional integration or less effort to come together? I think the person is asking, how can Pan-Africanism realistically be built or achieved, given that even regional integration, which should have been easier in principle, is already very difficult to accomplish. I think he's questioning the feasibility of Pan-Africanism and suggesting that if regional blocs struggle to integrate, then continental unity seems even more challenging. I don't want to misinterpret the question, but that's my understanding of the question. And the next participant, Abdullahi, he said, I would love to know from all the speakers if the now established Board of Peace has eroded the credibility of the United Nations, and what mechanism the AU has in dealing this new reality of a new fragmented world order. He then questioned what smarter navigation on the part of African states mean. He said, please explain. Okay, and now I'll give back to the speakers to respond to the questions.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for your thoughtful observations and some questions. And it just reminded me of something that I would like to say at the outset, because we're really having a conversation and we can only exchange views. I am not an expert, so I don't want to have an expert approach to responding to a question. I'll express another opinion based on the issues that you have said. Recently, in Nairobi, a prominent African public intellectual, Mahmoud Mamdani, who just wrote a book on Uganda, had a book launch in Nairobi. And what surprised me and surprised him profoundly, as a matter of fact, is they organized the book launch in a place that could hold a maximum of 200, 300 people. Okay? So when it was announced, 2,000 people showed up. Okay? This is a book about Uganda, but at the same time is also about state formation, state decay, and what's to be done in Africa. And what surprised me and surprised him as well was in Africa, especially the youth want to engage. They want a platform where they want to ask all of these questions and all of that. The fact 2,000 people showed up for a book launch. In New York, you will not get maybe 150 people, more than not 100 people. Okay. Here, I have seen a book launch only with 20, 30, 40 people. So, it just tells you that this time people are so politicized, they want to engage. And therefore, the kind of services that Amani is providing is actually important in the context when you speak also about youth. Of course, the name Mamdani has its own attraction, but the attraction is a young African Ugandan who became the mayor of New York. How he did it. If he can do it, the rest of us here also can do it. So there is that symbolism that the name Mamdani provides. Maybe that's why they showed up, but it's all interlinked. So the question, a couple of observations. Let me, as I said, I'll not answer them satisfactorily, but let me point out to a couple of them. My sister, Adale, I'm so happy to see you. I was really pleasantly surprised. I thought you were not here, but very welcome, and that's great. So, okay, you triggered the question about Pan-Africanism. The best place to start to talk about Pan-Africanism is Pan-Africanism was our organizing principle before the nation states in Africa were born. All right? The first Pan-African conference took place in Manchester. Before that, there were small meetings, but it took place in Manchester, and 80 years since Manchester was just celebrated last November. Okay? So Pan-Africanism came before the nation states. All right, and that's very important. And when we say it came before the nation state, Pan-Africanism is basically a people's movement in its origin, in its essence. That's why, in spite of the failure of African states to honor its principles, Pan-Africanism still remains a potent political force across the African continent. So, because it was before the state. So, the first generation of Pan-Africanists, the Nkrumas, the Secutures, the first generation, the militant Pan-Africanists especially, when they started getting their independence, one thing that shocked them is how they are inheriting from colonialism fragmented countries, small countries who don't make sense by themselves unless Africanist duty was to make sense out of this fragmentation and overcome it. All right, overcome it. So they tried to create an institution, OAU, and it was not an easy institution to create. So the first generation was really to overcome this colonial legacy and try to make sense out of it, given the fragmentation. The other thing is they also recognized at that period, there are some legacy issues that require collective action, collective solution, rather than unilateral action taken by a country. So what they did was, 1963 was African Union was established here, and after that, 1964, there was a meeting in Cairo. Between 1963 and 1964, there were 7 conflicts in the continent, and all of them were based on boundaries, borders. All right, Ethiopia, Somalia, Tanzania, Malawi, Morocco, Algeria, Mali, Senegal. So the first duty of the first Pan-African was over borders. So they met in Cairo and they accepted to adopt the colonial borders. When they were doing that, if you go back and you read the speeches that they were giving at that time to say colonial borders should be out, it is really they saw this adoption of the colonial border as a conflict resolution mechanism. To stop the war, we need to do this, and then our Pan-African project will transcend the colonial border. That was their thinking. And then the liberation of Africa. The second generation of Pan-Africanists were, states got their independence. All the coups, the corruption, that the state became an enemy of the people. And all of that. So to make a stop to that in the 1990s, what I call the NEPAD period, they were in-looking Pan-Africanists. They were talking about governance issue. They were talking about charter. They have adopted a number of charters, like the Charter on Democracy, election, and all of that, the Charter on Women's Rights, the establishment of the African Court of Justice. All of these were actually inward-looking and tried to correct what was going wrong. And the NEPAD period required leadership, which was provided by a cluster of African countries, and they were able to adopt this NEPAD program, which made it possible for us to transit from the OAU to the now we have reached another limit. And the only way we transcend the problem that we have is what kind of a Pan-African articulation, definition of the problem will make it possible for us to tackle this thing. So the consistency of Pan-Africanism should be appreciated in that sense. I think right now our status is really dismal, very dismal. No leadership at the continental level as well as also at the national level. Therefore, how do we trigger, for something, for a process, and this kind of conversation becomes important. The last thing, again, I'm not answering all of your questions, but it's just to give it a framework to help us see how we can address, is the youth, the issue of youth, okay? We are a continent of youth. Everybody is saying that 80% of our generation, of our people are youth, educated youth, highly motivated youth, looking for outlet of energy. The governance structure within each of our countries is an impediment. The kind of a relationship the African state established with youth directly for most of the time, now there is a change, but the very crucial period, they only get in touch with youth when they want to recruit them to go to war. All right, so that was the entry point. But now we have a highly politicized youth looking for engagement on governance, looking and engagement about the future, and the fact that the outside world is hostile because of migrations and all of that, they will be looking inwards. So we better in reformulating the next generation of what Pan-Africanism means, we have to make the youth central to that in a conversation. There must be a way of doing it. Otherwise, it will be a disaster. You know, the issue of legitimacy. African institutions have legitimacy deficit because they are not responding to this generation. You know, the African country states in each of its countries, they have what do you call deficit of legitimacy. I want to connect this, and I'll stop with what Ambassador Huru raised, this issue of a middle power and all of that. There are middle powers, and then there are middle powers. Indonesia is a middle power. Malaysia is a middle power. Economic-based middle powers. Canada is a middle power. A lot of European countries, basically both. But there are now middle powers, especially in the Middle East, who are not only economic and they have a lot of money. So it's not like they are not economic, but also they have ambitions which has a security and an aggressive expansionist agenda embedded in it. All right. So our institutions are having a problem managing them. All right. They are overwhelming us. They are overwhelming our continental institution or regional institution, and they are also overwhelming the country, each of the countries. But at the heart of it is a lot of the countries, especially in this region, are at war with their people. The legitimacy of each of the country is being contested and is contested violently. All right? So they are seeking legitimacy not inside to compensate for the internal delegitimacy they have. They are looking for legitimacy from outside. And then you will have an elite compact or an elite connectivity, that is symbiotic between elites who, for survival purposes, need an outside legitimacy because they cannot get it inside, and the turmoil connected with that, and the continuation and the war manifestation of it, and the kind of war that are actually being conducted in this part in our part of the world is a kind of war that is so fragmented. It will be difficult to have a political outcome as a solution to war. In the past, you used to have war, and then there is a political outcome. Why the war was done will always have a political solution. Now, war is becoming an end in itself. And the fact that it's an end in itself is fueled by the kind of a relationship we have established with these middle powers. This particular aggressive, highly resourced, highly energetic middle powers that came to prominence at a time when international institutions are fracturing. International order is fracturing. So that is the space. And they're utilizing this space in a manner that is unraveling us. It is only in that context. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I will be brief, just taking two questions. Oh, just a second, let me find them. Yeah. One, I think it was Hiroi, about the issue of the multilateral system as we know it. And I think it was Abdul who said it did not serve Africa well. My point was to say, we were not involved in its design. It's an unbalanced system. Just look at the composition of the Security Council, look at the functioning of the financial institutions, and I could, refer to so many other rules on intellectual property and so on, that are clearly were designed for the most powerful countries and were not fully beneficial to Africa. But yet, the existence of a multilateral system means that we could build coalitions to advance our interests. And by the way, look at how Africa used the UN in the 60s and 70s to advance the agenda on decolonization and fighting apartheid. We use the existing system as imbalanced as it is to advance our interests. So, and of course, if that system becomes weaker, as is the case currently, it means our bargaining power is decreasing, because then you're dealing with countries bilaterally and based on raw power, and we don't have much of it. So the existence of a multilateral system, as unbalanced as it is, provides us with room to mitigate, or somehow to, to mitigate our weakness in terms of raw power. Now, I won't speak of rule-based order, and I'm not alone, I have read it elsewhere. Many people, and I do also, challenge the concept of rule-based order, because I just wonder why we don't speak of international law. It's just so simple. International law, we negotiate, all of us, big and small, we ratify, and we are all committed to respecting it. Now, when you speak of rule-based international order, when you follow, literally it's ruled by few, implemented consistently, and disregarded when inconvenient. This is, and I could give so many examples, of how the rule, and that's why, in actual fact, I remember I was in an AU meeting, I think it was in Nairobi last year, during the review of APSA, and I insisted that AU should not use the concept of rule-based order, because I just can't understand the mere fact that those who use it are reluctant to refer to international law, make me suspicious. And during the Luanda summit, AU-EU summit, I think it was one of the points of contention where Africans said, no, we don't want to hear, we don't know rule-based order. We know international law, and this is what we should use. Now, again, international law has never been completely insulated from raw power. It's clear. We were colonized under international law as uncivilized people. We were sold as slaves under international law. But still, it provides some room to maneuver. And we have to be smart enough, to use multilateral fora and international law to, of course, advance our interests. Now, incentives for Pan-Africanism. Very good question. And that's why, in fact, in my intervention, I did recognize that political will is in short supply currently. We are not in the moment we were in the early 2000s with the launch of the AU. Many of you are young enough. I think my young sister, or I would even say daughter there, who was surprised that probably I'm alive since I worked at the AU in 1994, but I'm still alive and I hope for a very long period, I don't know. But anyway, bottom line is, yes, we don't have the same level of political will. It is uneven among member states. It's clear, we can see it. Completely different from what you had in the early 2000s. For those of you who are old enough to remember what happened in the early 2000s, believe me, when you attend an AU summit in 2003, 2004, 2005, and 2006, it was a completely different atmosphere, absolutely different. When you attend the meetings on the African peer review mechanism, I'm saying you had a level of seriousness and commitment that few of you, those who are young, cannot imagine, I remember also, I also remember at that period when we had PSC meetings, all partners would line up, waiting in the meeting, waiting for the outcome of the PSC communiques, because the PSC communique drove discussions on African issues. I'm not sure we are there now. But there are incentives, and precisely because political will is weak, the role of the Commission becomes bigger, more important. Its role is precisely to create conditions for that political will to emerge. And there are ways of doing it. I worked for 23 years at the EU, and I could give you many examples in which member states were not particularly committed, but we managed to push them in a certain direction. But you have to engage them. They have to be the priority. You have to go to them with options. You have to go to them with ideas, not just sit and say we're waiting for political will, because it will never drop from the sky. You have to generate, you have to work hard. You have to give motivation to member states to support you. Now, what could be the incentives? There are plenty, because you see, when we speak of the AU, often we only refer to the political aspect. we refer to the Summit of Head of State. We see the political, it's a partial view. We see the pathological, we see what is not working. And when it works, people hardly make a connection with the AU. I give you few African institutions that work and work perfectly well. PanVac, they are in Bishop 2, 45 kilometers from here. Pan-African Vaccine Center. If you eat meat in Africa, 9 times out of 10, that meat was tested with vaccine the animals somehow were treated with vaccine tested in Bishop 2. Few people know it. Literally no one knows it. The Inter-African Bureau on Animal Resources based in Nairobi, I don't know how to say it in English, pest bovine, rinderpest, I believe, was eradicated thanks to them. And their member states attend those meetings, they know, but no one makes the connection with the AU. Whatever goes well has nothing to do with the AU. When it goes bad, it's the AU, because we see only the politics and we see only what is not working. So, when the AU delivers, concretely, member states can see what's going on. You got my point. Another example I can give you. You take the 3 regimes that came to power through coups in Central Sahel. They decided to pull out of ECOWAS. In my view, a big mistake. I think ECOWAS is a strong pillar of African Union and African unity. But they did not pull out from the arrangement on free movement of people. Why? Because they see their interest is an incentive for them to stay in the system. Single African air transport market. Again, some member states are strongly committed to the process because they can see Ethiopia is strongly committed, and rightly so, to the single African air transport market, because they could see if that arrangement is implemented, it's beneficial to Ethiopian Airlines and it's beneficial to Africa. Let's be frank, because Ethiopian is an African airline and no longer an Ethiopian airline. So, again, the Commission has to play that proactive role, delivering and engaging member states, showing results and showing why acting in certain ways can bring additional benefits. And I believe it's doable. It's harder today than it was in the early 2000s, but I strongly believe, as a former OAU, AU staff, that we can do it. I think I'll stop here. These were the few issues I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Really, many thanks to the colleagues that have participated in this discussion. I will try to just answer some of those questions that have not been responded to, and I also try to be brief. I noted some hands that were still up. Maybe interest to ask further questions. So I think I'll just go briefly on the middle powers and the bit that was asked on the gap. So apart from the aggressive posture of some of the middle powers, I think some of the things which we'll have to think about is the issue of leadership that was said already in the intervention and trust. I use the DRC example because it is important that we saw the initiative and agency of an African member state, and what led down to the breakdown of that process was a trust between the African leadership. And then we saw the intervention of a middle power in that case. And we hope that that intervention will continue to be positive. Just to give you an example. So we need to recommit to our regional economic communities, make them effective. We saw in other processes in South Sudan where mistrust in IGAD has led to a situation where it is concerning. And we see in Sudan, the initial paralysis was this proliferation of mediation mechanisms, middle powers, and a lot of reliance on those mediation mechanisms. And we've seen the fatigue by those middle powers, and now we do not see that level of engagement and involvement that is necessary to address the Sudan issue. A sister from Tanzania, I believe, asked a question on the role of the AU and reference to current conflict situation context in the continent. I think my response, in addition to what has been said by the excellencies, is that, of course, the AU is the sum of its all. We have an excellent African peace and security architecture. Of course, we can continue to review it. So it's about how do we use initiatives within the architecture that we have to address generally these issues which you've mentioned. There's one part now of resolving conflict. We don't do it in the Security Council. We only manage conflict because of the paralysis. So it behoves the African peace and security architecture to get into conflict resolution, and we need those mechanisms to start with their initiatives. Whether it's the panel of the wise, whether it's FemWise, using the REX, I think it's about time. On the water issue, I think it's very important, the theme of the year. I can use one concrete example where the SRSG on peace consolidation in West Africa, you know us, SRSG Shimawa said that he wanted to use water diplomacy to address the issues in the Sahel. And so I think water can be an important opportunity for cooperation. That's how I put it, because on one aspect, you can look at it as a threat multiplier, so it may not be necessarily the cause of conflict, but of course could be a threat multiplier linked to climate security, but also it could be a direct cause of conflict if the situation is not addressed in time. So I think it's an important point to look at water diplomacy from the peace and security perspective, and essentially looking at cooperation and using water resources in that regard. Your second question on the corridor, I think we just have to go back to the humanitarian principles. Basically, if we apply the humanitarian principles, you can apply it to the issue of water, you can apply it to other issues where you need to protect civilians. I believe there was a question relating to spaces for civil society and the youth. One of the things we did before exiting the Security Council was to table a resolution together with Guyana on youth, peace and security at the 10th anniversary of the first resolution. Some of the things we call for in that resolution is for the implementation of national plans, national implementation plans. So I think it's an important point for many of the youth-led organizations and civil society to plug in the implementation of the national plans on youth, peace and security, because it provides the space. In essence, the question you're asking about is about conflict prevention. And conflict prevention means that you need to engage and address those issues. And we use examples, particularly in Madagascar, in putting forward a resolution and ensuring that it was supported unanimously by 15 members of the Security Council. I will not go into the details because of time, but I think indeed there is need for our conflict prevention tools to include dialogues with various groups, including stakeholders, including youth and civil society. The last question, because I think it also concerns an action we took in the Security Council in our presidency, was the adoption of Resolution 2803. That is the comprehensive ceasefire plan in Gaza. That is where the Board of Peace was established. And we voted for the resolution, but in our explanation of vote, we made it clearly, and throughout the negotiation process, we made sure that we included language relating to international law. We included language relating to time frame. So it's a temporal entity that was given the blessing and endorsed by the Security Council, but agreed in the Sharm el-Sheikh agreement. It is limited to Gaza. It is different from the charter that we see now that was really signed in Davos. But that's not the Board of Peace that was endorsed by the Security Council. So there's a big question of legitimacy. So I would urge that when we look at the BOP for the African Union, for African member states, we look at it from the lens of its temporal nature, its specific scope, that is Gaza, certainly its limited mandate and not necessarily a rival to UN Security Council. If anything, if it were to be a rival, then the proponent would not have brought it to the Security Council for it to be blessed. So at least I think that's a good way to answer to the question of it being a rival Security Council. I'll stop at that because I think I wanted to provide space for more engagement. Thank you.
I think we have reached the final point. So in the interest of respecting each and every one of you here and online, I will pass on the mic to my dear colleague Tefi to close us off. But there is one thing that I would like to make, and that is the interventions from Abdul, from Juan, from Michael, will all be published. And therefore will be available more widely. The second and important point I want to make is to sincerely apologize for many people, more than 1,000, who registered to be here in this hall for this meeting. due to space, we were not able to confirm their participation. And we proposed that they join us online. Those who did see the email, we thank them for joining us, but we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience that the situation has created. And with that, Tefi, close us off.
In closing this very insightful discussions, I would like to ask you, our dear participants, to give a round of applause for our speakers. I wish if all of them were here. Thank you very much for your insights, for your reflections that were very thought-provoking. With that, I would like to thank also our participants who have engaged in the discussions in reflecting on what has been said and to instigating our speakers to say more and to contribute more for the discussions. The time is, in the interest of time, I don't want to say much. But one thing that I would like to say is we have a lot to do from the discussion. That's what we gathered. And our speakers have given us the mechanisms, the tools to go forward and how to use opportunities, the existing opportunities to tackle the challenges. So it's our responsibility as Amani, but also it's your responsibility to take forward these inputs, these proposals, mechanisms that were suggested into bringing a concrete resolution for the current challenge that we have. With that, thank you very much. And for the Amani Africa team, congratulations. And thank you, Solomon, for your guidance and support. And I would like to thank our partners, Finland, Ireland, Switzerland, and Norway. We would like to thank their support. And most importantly, I would also like to thank our partners in organizing this dialogue, ECOSOC and the Embassy of Burundi, for making this happen. Thank you very much.